I'm Jack Cunningham. I'm the curatorial and exhibition intern here at the Capitol Jewish Museum. And welcome to our third program as part of Democracy in Action. Tonight's program is a webinar, which means you'll not be able to see other attendees, only the presenters, just me at the moment. During tonight's Q&A, we ask that you put all the questions into the Q&A box down below so that myself and our moderator, Dr. Pam Nadell, can see them. Before we get started, I'd like to show you all two renderings of the future museum where you will able to attend more programs like this one when we open our doors in 2022. If I can get, here we go. So building this museum has been years in the making. We've been hard at work raising funds, designing exhibits, collecting stories that show the intersection of American Jewish experience and democracy here in the nation's capital. During the past year, the work hasn't stopped as we've been busily creating from our kitchens and living rooms to bring a museum that is not only uniquely Jewish in DC, but also another center of community. We've officially begun construction in January, and the construction is moving very quickly. Here's a time lapse of what has happened so far. You can see the building is flying up. And this is what it will look like when it's all complete. Our tiny synagogue that could moved for the last time in January 2019 to the corner of 3rd and F Street Northwest, and has since been restored. We're ready to build a modern structure that will connect the historic synagogue, making it our most precious artifact. The museum will be free to all and open for special event rentals as well as programs. We'll have a multi-purpose auditorium for speaker engagements and holiday events, a community action lab that not only fosters curiosity, but inspires action, and a temporary gallery space where we can bring exhibitions that are created around the world into the city. Our permanent exhibition will explore Jewish identity and the history of Jewish Washington through the lens of civic engagement, where our main themes are identity, issues, participation, mapping historic Jewish Washington, and a conversation table. We're looking forward to the day when we can welcome you into our building in the fall of 2022 and gather in person to share stories and further strengthen our community. You can follow along of all the updates and stay in touch about future programming just like this one by subscribing to our newsletter and following us on social media. Thank you for joining us this evening. The program will be posted on our YouTube page shortly after and on our website. We hope we see you all at one of our upcoming events in person, all of which can be found on our website, capitoljewishmuseum.org. Themes that emerge from tonight's talk, such as protesting, organizing in Jewish history, a community that will be explored throughout the exhibitions in our future programs and events. Tonight's event is with local author Scott Seligman. He's an award-winning writer, historian, a genealogist, and former corporate executive who holds an undergraduate degree in American history from Princeton and a master's degree from Harvard. He spent much of his career in Taiwan, Hong Kong, and China, is fluent in Mandarin, and reads and writes Chinese. He has worked as a legislative assistant to a member of U.S. Congress, lobbied the Chinese government on behalf of American business, and managed a multinational public relations agency in China. Served as a spokesperson and communications director, and taught English in Taiwan, Chinese in DC. His latest book, The Third Degree, The Triple Murder That Shook Washington and Changed American Criminal Justice, won the Gold Medal in History in the 2019 Independent Publisher 2019 Book Awards, and the Great Kosher Meat War of 1902, his first Jewish-themed book, was named a finalist in the 2020 National Jewish Book Awards last month. He will be in conversation with Dr. Pam Nadell. Professor Pam Nadell holds the Patrick Clendenin Chair in Women's and Gender History at American University, where she directs the Jewish Studies program and received the university's highest award, Scholar/Teacher of the Year. Her books include Women Who Would Be Rabbis, A History of Women's Ordination, 1889 to 1985, a Historical Society's Lee Max Friedman Award for Distinguished Service. Her consulting work for museums includes the National Museum of American Jewish History and the Library of Congress. She's a fellow of the American Academy for Jewish Research, and her recent book, American Jewish Women, A History from Colonial Times to Today, won the 2019 National Jewish Book Awards Jewish Book of the Year. I'm looking forward to hearing from Scott and Pam as they dive into this moment in history where a group of women use their collective power to create change. And with that, I will pass the baton over to Dr. Pam Nadell to begin.
So first of all, welcome everyone. It's so great to see you here, or at least see you metaphorically, shall I say. We're going to open with a presentation by Scott Seligman about this amazing, the first kosher meat boycott. And then Scott and I will tell you a little bit about how we came to know each other because of this boycott, even though it happened about almost 120 years ago. So Scott, take it away.
Okay, thanks. I want to say thanks to the Capitol Jewish Museum and the DC Jewish Community Center for hosting the program this evening. Also, I want to thank Rebecca and Jack, and also Stephanie Fry, who's not here tonight, for making the arrangements for it. And I want to say it's a special honor to share the stage with Dr. Pamela Nadell this evening. She is a luminary in the field of American Jewish studies. And on a personal note, Pam was a constant source of support and wise counsel for me throughout the research and the preparation of this book. So I'm very grateful to her for that as well. Now let me just figure out how to share my screen here, and we'll work it from there. Let's see. Share, and okay, can you see the slides okay? We good? All right, we're good. Now, if you've ever read anything I've written in the past, you know that virtually everything I've published up until now has had something to do with the Chinese people, the Chinese language, Chinese Americans. I also wrote a Chinese cookbook and a Chinese phrase book for travelers. But this is the book that's not like the others. It's really my first foray into Jewish American history, at least as far as a book is concerned. It's not actually my first Jewish rodeo as far as writing is concerned. I'm a genealogist. I've published several websites about family history. And I've also written a couple of articles, more general articles that have appeared in the foreword. And this is one of them. Came out several years ago, almost a decade ago, actually. More than a decade ago, actually. Which was the story, interestingly enough, it took place on the Lower East Side just 1 year after this book takes place. And it was in the wake of the Kishinev pogrom, which was the first major pogrom in Russia of the 20th century. To everyone's surprise, several leaders from New York's Chinatown approached the Jewish community because they wanted to put on a fundraiser for the Jews of Kishinev. So I wrote an article called "The Night New York's Chinese Went Out for Jews." You can think about that for a minute. There's a little humor in it. And that also got me thinking about the relationship between the two groups. And it also got me kind of thinking also about my own forebears, some of whom did spend time on the Lower East Side on the way into the United States. So it got me a little more focused on the Jewish experience there. Now, the genesis of this particular work was an article that I read in a journal called American Jewish History. It was written in 1980 by the late Dr. Paula Hyman, who was a professor of modern Jewish history at Yale. Dr. Hyman was the first woman to head a Jewish studies program at a major university. And I think it was her interest in feminism that led her to look at the origins of activism among immigrant Jewish women. And it is she and not I who deserve credit for rescuing this amazing story from history. And as you know, probably from what you have read about it, the main narrative of this book concerns Orthodox Jewish women who took to the streets of the Lower East Side of New York in 1902 to protest rising prices for kosher meat that put it out of the reach of many families who were keeping strictly kosher homes. And I found the story of mostly uneducated immigrant wives and mothers, many some of whom didn't even speak English at all, who realized they faced a common threat and discovered their collective power as consumers in their new home. I found it to be a very inspiring story. And it made me think of my grandmother, my mother's mother, who was 10 years old and living on Orchard Street at the time this was going on. I don't know that she participated in the boycott, but her mother probably did. Great grandma isn't around anymore. She'd be about 160 today if I could ask her. So I can't be absolutely sure that I have a personal connection to this, but I like to think that I did. And I wanted to read further on the topic, but I discovered that no one had really dug more deeply into it than Dr. Hyman had. And she wrote 40 years ago, and she left us only 14 pages about it. So I decided to do some investigating of my own. And fortunately for me, I had tools available that were not available to her in 1980. One of the things that's happened in the 40 years since she wrote is that vintage newspapers, not only from New York, but from all over the country, have now been posted on the internet and through the magic of optical character recognition, rendered keywords searchable. I can't tell you how important a development this is. Because in the old days, if you were researching a story like this, you'd go to the library, you'd know that you wanted to look in the New York papers, you might have an idea of the time that the time frame you were looking at, but you were still working on a microfilm reader and turning that crank, hoping that you're going to find an article and never sure whether you really would. With optical character recognition and keyword search, we find things we didn't know we were looking for. So I could sit in this very chair where I am right now and search the New York Times, the New York Herald, the New York Tribune, the Sun, the World, the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, not to mention the papers outside of New York, the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, the St. Louis Republic. And in the process of doing research for this, I came on probably something around something in the neighborhood of 2,000 articles, because this actually was a national story while it was going on. It was not just a local story in New York. So I had a great database of the view of what was going on the Lower East Side as far as the English language newspapers were concerned. The next step was to use the tools of genealogical research to find out more about the women who actually led the boycott. And for this, I used census records. I used immigration records, ship passenger manifests. I looked at naturalization records, at passport records. I looked at vital records. I looked at obituaries, and I even looked at gravestones to make sure about some of the dates. And I was able, through these tools, to locate and contact descendants of some of the women who had participated and ask them about stories and images, if they had any photographs. Not one of them had been aware of their forebears' participation in this boycott. So I found myself sharing a lot of information that they didn't know about their own grandparents. And then there was the Yiddish press. Yiddish is not one of my languages, but I was fortunate that I got help in New York looking through the records at YIVO, the Yiddish archive. And Dr. Miriam Isaacs, who was local here in Washington and a neighbor of mine, was willing to sit down with me and guide me expertly through probably something like 3 or 4 dozen articles that appeared in the Yiddish press. So I got the benefit of the Jewish community's perspective. And not only the Jewish community's perspective, but perspectives within the Jewish community. Because I looked at the Forward, which was a socialist paper, and then the Arbeiter Zeitung, which also had a socialist point of view. But I was also able to look at the Tageblatt, which was an Orthodox paper. And the Orthodox Jews didn't look at the problem exactly the same way that the secular ones did. So I got not only the perspectives of the English papers, I also got perspectives within the Jewish community. Now, since I was researching a book and not an article, I had the luxury of asking some questions that Dr. Hyman didn't have room for in her 14-page article. Like, for example, why prices went up and who was responsible for it, and why did it all happen in the first place? The women blamed their retail butchers, who were the people that they bought from every day or every week. But the principal culprits, I discovered, were actually hundreds of miles away and not visible on the Lower East Side. So let me begin by talking about them. I want to talk about the source of the problem, and then I'll cut to the chase and we'll talk about the actual boycott. Now, this is the turn of the 20th century. We're talking about the era of the trusts, of companies that came together in order to corner markets. I'm sure you've heard of the Standard Oil Trust. There was a steel trust. There was a railroad trust back then. The one you probably, or at least I hadn't heard of, was the meat trust or the beef trust. And these were primarily Chicago-based companies with names like Swift and Armour that you probably recognize from the supermarket even today. And they made up this organization that was conspiring to corner the American market for meat. And they did it in several ways. They pressured the cattlemen to sell their cows at cheap prices. They got kickbacks from the railroads for using them to transport the meat. They controlled the supply of meat that was sent to the cities, and most of the big markets for meat were still on the East Coast at this point. And ultimately, they gouged consumers. Now, they didn't single out the Jewish community. The price of all meat went up, but observant Jews were hit the hardest, and there were several reasons for this. Now, when I look at the kosher meat market today, my understanding as a child has always been that kosher meat is more expensive because you have to pay the shachtim, the slaughterers, and the mashkichim, the supervisors, a salary, because this is what they do, and you have to add that into the price of the meat. And that, of course, was so true 120 years ago. But there were other factors that were at work in 1902 that may not be as much at work today. And it gets back to actually to the invention of the refrigerator car, rail car, which happened in the 1870s. Before that, most of New York's beef was slaughtered in the city, locally. But with the invention of the refrigerator car, you could transport carcasses far more efficiently than you could transport whole cattle. And so it became wiser and more economical to do the slaughtering in the Midwest and then just send the carcasses to the East Coast. You could fit more in a railroad car. They didn't die on you because they were already gone. And you were not shipping body parts that were not in fact going to be edible. So by the turn of the century, most of New York's beef was in fact slaughtered in Chicago or in another Midwestern city. The exception was kosher meat. Kosher meat couldn't be handled this way. It had to be slaughtered locally. And the reason for this is that Jewish law forbids the consumption of meat that has not been koshered, a term related to the word kosher, which essentially means soaked and salted. That's what had to happen to the meat within 72 hours of slaughter. And the reason for that is that blood coagulates after 72 hours. And the whole purpose of the Jewish law mandates the removal of the lifeblood of the animal before the animal is eaten. Well, this couldn't be done on beef that was slaughtered in Chicago. It had to be done locally. And this meant, and furthermore, it was done in the home during this period. And I double checked that with my 95-year-old aunt to make sure that my bubby did it that way. And sure enough, she would go to the kosher butcher, buy a cut of meat, bring it home, soak it, and salt it before she served it to my Zadie and the rest of the family. And what this meant was that the beef consumed by observant Jews had to come to New York on the hoof, which was more expensive. So it added another layer of cost in. Then too, we had the problem that typically in the United States now, only the forquarters of the cow are typically sold as kosher. I think it's up to the 14th rib. And this traces back to a biblical reference to Jacob wrestling the angel of God, in which his sciatic nerve was injured. And because of that, there are certain nerves and fats and tendons in cows that have to be removed before the meat can be considered kosher. And these exist far more concentrated form in the hindquarters of an animal than they do in the forequarters. It doesn't mean that not all of that only part of a cow can be kosher. With enough effort, all of those things can be plucked out of the hindquarters of a cow too, and you could technically have a flank steak or a sirloin steak that was kosher. And in the old country, sometimes they did pay people to do that. But in New York, it was much easier to just sell the forequarters to the Jewish community and to sell the hindquarters to either non-practicing Jews or Gentiles. And so that's what was done. That's what was done. But they couldn't get as much money for the hindquarters as the forequarters, so it was another cost factor. Now, once the animals arrived in the New York area, they went to Jersey City in pens, and were held in pens for a couple of days. And then they were shipped by barge to Manhattan. And in this era, there were 3 major slaughterhouses on Manhattan Island that specialized, at least partially, in kosher meat slaughter. One of them was on the Hudson. The other 2 were on the East River. This is the picture of those. Schwartzel's and Sulzberger was one of them, and United Dressed Beef was another one. Just to orient you, that tract of land that you're looking at is where the United Nations stands today. And these were, without exception, operated by German Jews. These were, and this is one of them, Ferdinand Sulzberger. Like the others in charge, he was an earlier, his family had immigrated earlier. They were somewhat well-to-do at this point. They owned the slaughterhouse operation. And many of the German Jews at this stage were not terribly observant. It's certainly not in the same way that the Russian and the Eastern Europeans were. And there was not a lot of love lost between these two groups. The Russian immigrants looked at Sulzberger. They called him a Hebrew with a shaved beard. They referred derisively to people like him who had gotten fat from eating treif or non-kosher meat. But the condescension was mutual. The Germans looked at the Eastern Europeans and the Russians as unassimilable bumpkins who were in fact embarrassing to them because they worried a bit that these sort of unwashed masses coming in from Eastern Europe were going to evoke prejudice from Gentiles, and they were jealous of their own acceptance into Gentile society. So that's kind of what was going on. Okay, after the slaughterhouses, the meat was sold to the individual kosher butchers on the Lower East Side and elsewhere in the New York area. There were about 600 kosher butchers in New York, or kosher butcher shops in New York at this stage. So when the Midwestern meat cartel started pumping up the prices, the slaughterhouses basically transferred these. They pushed them onto the local butcher shops, and the price of a pound of flank and a pound of kosher beef went up about 50% in just a matter of a few weeks. It had been 12 cents a pound. It was now 18 cents a pound, which is about 5 1/4 in today's dollars. Now that doesn't sound like a lot of money to us today, but it became unaffordable for a lot of Jewish communities, a lot of Jewish families, whose husband, the breadwinners, who were typically the husbands in this age, would bring home something like $2 a day. So they were making $10, maybe $12 a week. And the extra 6 cents a pound mounted up, and it was a matter of real concern to a lot of families. And of course, for most of them, buying non-kosher meat was out of the question. So they had a problem. At precisely the same time that all of this is going on, I discovered the administration of President Theodore Roosevelt is actually going after the cartel. The government believes they are in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act, which they were. The Sherman Antitrust Act had been passed, I think it was in the 1890s, so it was already in force. And they went after them in court. So precisely the same time this is all going on the Lower East Side, there's another drama going on, which is going after these companies to get them to stop operating like a cartel. And they did take them to court. In fact, it all eventually went to the Supreme Court, although it took several years for it to happen. And the court ruled against them, and eventually the cartel was dismantled. But now back to the main narrative, which was the women's strike. So in early 1902, the prices rose precipitously. And the retail butchers were the first to sound the alarm. They knew that their customers were not going to be able to sit still for a 50% rise in the price of meat. After all, they would typically issue credit to their customers who would settle up the bills at the end of the week when the husbands came home with their paychecks, with their pay envelopes. So a lot of people in the Lower East Side were living from hand to mouth at this point. So they knew this was a non-starter. And to their credit, what they decided to do was to get together, and everybody shut down their shops for several days as a way of pressuring the slaughterhouses into lowering the prices. And there were some negotiations, and they did actually manage to get some minor concessions out of the slaughterhouses, but nothing that really got to the heart of the matter, which was how much a pound of beef was going to cost. And what happened was when the butchers reopened, they actually started charging prices that were higher rather than lower than what they had been charging before they closed their doors. And this was the spark that set off the women. Now, I'd like to introduce you to the women. I have to tell you that my biggest disappointment in working on this book was that I was unable to get photographs of them. And believe me, I looked really hard. Newspapers at the turn were just beginning to run photos at the turn of the 20th century. And so I wasn't able to find anything there, but I was hoping that when I contacted relatives, that somebody would have a picture of grandma in some attic, someplace, but to a person, they were not able to provide it. They had pictures of of these women's children, but not the women themselves. So I had to live without that. So I can't show you their faces, but I think I can still paint a pretty good portrait of some of them. So let's start with Sarah Edelson, who started the whole thing when she called a meeting the very same day the butchers reopened. She called a meeting, it was May 14th, 1902, at Monroe Palace, which was her family's saloon, in order to fight the rise in prices. And she spread the word. She expected maybe 50 people would show up and they could talk about what they were going to do to try to get prices down. Well, 500 women showed up. They spilled out on Monroe Street. They couldn't all fit in the saloon. And so they had a huge meeting. Sarah she was a force of nature. She was a large woman, physically quite imposing. She weighed about 250 pounds, a natural leader, a born organizer. She had arrived in the US actually in 1868, which was quite early for a Russian Jew. The real wave of immigration from the Pale didn't start in earnest until the 1880s, but she was quite early. And by the time of this strike, she was 51 years old. She had given birth to 6 children. But motherhood had never kept Sarah Edelson homebound. She helped out at the saloon. She was also a shadchan, a matchmaker. And so she spent time trying to get Jewish lonely hearts together so that they could to create marriages. She never shrank from a fight, Sarah. She was always at the ready, and this was a fight that was made to order for her. Next is Carolyn Shatzberg. Carolyn was a Romanian. She was from Romania. She had married in her native land. She emigrated in 1885. She was about the same age as Sarah. She was just a year apart. She had just lost her husband when the strike began. She was a white-haired widow. She was still in widow's weeds, as a matter of fact. 2 of her 7 children were still at home. And she was a woman of some means. She had a little bit more resources than Sarah and some of the other women did. I suspect she could have afforded the extra bump in the price of kosher meat if she had wanted to, but she liked the idea that she was fighting for people less fortunate than her. She'd been in America for 18 years. She had mastered English. In fact, she was almost eloquent in English. When they interviewed her at the New York World, she really showed that she had a complete mastery of the language. She eventually took over leadership of the movement, but not without a struggle with Sarah Edelson, and you can read the book for that one. It was pretty dramatic. Third is Paulina Finkel, 32 years old, mother of 4. She'd been in America for about a decade. She was the one who placed the announcements in the Yiddish newspapers, calling on the women in the Jewish quarter to take action. And she was also a member of a team that went to the mayor's office to seek a demonstration permit, which was denied, and also to ask that the police not interfere with the demonstrations, something that was also denied, because the police very much did interfere. And finally, Sarah Cohn, 31 years old. She was a woman of boundless energy. She had a house full of children. The youngest was like 2 months old, but it didn't stop her from organizing a cooperative butcher shop and basically as the proprietor and making it run as an alternative to the privately owned kosher butcher shops. She had emigrated from Austria at the age of 19, married a locksmith, and like I say, boundless energy. But it was another woman named Fanny Levy, 35 years old, Russian-born, mother of 6, who gets credit for what I think is the most quotable quote in the book. After the local butchers reopened, the community was disgusted with them. They thought that, they had supported them during this 5-day strike against the slaughterhouses, and they expected them to come back with something to show for it. And instead, what they did was they raised their prices. So Fanny Levy gave voice to what everybody was thinking. She said, "This is their strike." She said, "Let the women make a strike, then there will be a strike." Now, actually, that's what I wanted to call the book, "Let the Women Make a Strike." I thought it'd be a great title, but the publisher has a say in it too, and they decided to call it what it's been called. So "Let the Women Make a Strike" is actually just a chapter title. But I think it was a beautiful quote. And this actually is a picture of Monroe Palace, where it all began. This is courtesy of the Edelson family. Sarah Edelson is not in the picture, but 2 of her sons are, the 2 heavyset men who look just about like twins on either end of the picture were 2 of her sons. And so the morning after the meeting at Monroe Palace, something like 3,000 people, mostly Jewish women, recruited clearly that night. So somebody was staying up all night knocking on doors in the tenements. Some 3,000 women assembled in the pitch black in squads of 5 on every street in the Lower East Side where there were kosher butcher shops. And when the stores opened at 7 a.m., Their job was to wave off all potential buyers, explaining to them, this is not the time to buy kosher meat. We all need to do without meat for a little while longer. And if we do it and we work together, prices will come down. That was basically the message. Well, it was supposed to be nonviolent, but they didn't stay that way. Customers who would cross their picket lines and go in and buy meat anyway soon found out that their purchases were going to be snatched from them on the way out and thrown into the gutter. In some cases, they doused the meat with kerosene so it could never be eaten. Butchers who refused to close their stores were attacked. Their windows were smashed. Their stock was ruined. In some cases, their fixtures were destroyed, and they went out of business. There were even some reports of arson, not very many, and nothing major. The police were summoned to the neighborhood by the hundreds, and they were vicious. They attacked the pickets with nightsticks. They sent many women to the local hospitals and many more of them to the courts and then to jail. And all this goes on for 3 solid days until Friday night, May 16th, which is the beginning of Shabbat or Shabbos, the Jewish Sabbath. And the street protests stopped dead in their tracks. But because it was inappropriate for anything like that to go on the Sabbath. But the women decided they were not idle. They decided to use the opportunity provided by the Sabbath as a means to spread their message further, and in particular, spread it to the menfolk, the men who were at work all week and weren't necessarily witnessing what was going on the streets. 2 women in particular, we know them today only as Mrs. Silver and Mrs. Kisselov. And we only know that because of the Yiddish papers, because they didn't show up in the English language newspapers at all. But they spent quite an interesting Saturday going around to the synagogues and the shtiblach, the small congregations. In most places, like the Beis HaMidrash HaGadol, which was the largest synagogue on the Lower East Side, it actually just burned down just a few years ago. It's been around forever. They were received sympathetically at the Beis HaMidrash HaGadol. Mrs. Silver, turns out she had a Jewish education. She knew the Bible. And she was very clever about her approach to men. She reached into Genesis and told the story of when a conversation between God and Eve. God was talking about Adam. And the quote, which is a fairly well-known quote, God used the expression, he shall rule over thee, when he was talking to Eve. And he was talking about Adam, that Adam should rule over Eve. Well, Mrs. Silver she did very well with that. She asked the men to use this God-given authority that they had over their wives to appeal to them to support the strike, so that the boycott, so that the price of meat could come down. And it was very well received by most of the men in the synagogue that day. Then they went to the Eldridge Street Synagogue, which is still standing. It's a beautiful place to visit if you're in New York. And there, Mrs. Silver asked the rabbi to, and this is a quote, to lay a cherem on the meat. This was not a Yiddish term I had ever heard before, but a cherem apparently is a very potent Yiddish term for a boycott that is something in the nature of a religious ban. And the rabbi was unwilling to do this. He was very frank about the fear of retaliation by the butchers if he did. But he did ask the worshipers to support the boycott, and many said that they would. And it took some persuading, but he actually permitted the women to speak from the bima, which is the platform in the center of the synagogue where the Torah is read, that was traditionally off limits to women. Here, the women were taking advantage of a little used custom that I learned from Paula Hyman, actually. The Hebrew for it is bitul hatamid. I'm not sure how to say it in Yiddish. But what it does is it permits someone to interrupt worship services, even a Torah reading, if a matter of social justice or the redress of a wrong is at stake. And that's exactly what they did. Things went fairly well at Eldridge Street. They did not go so well at the Forsyth Street Synagogue. I don't have a picture of that to show you. But there, a very vocal worshiper objected to women mounting the bima. He said it was chutzpah and an insult to the Torah. And Mrs. Silver, who's one of my favorite characters in the book, she didn't miss a beat. She looked him square in the eye and she said, "The Torah will forgive me." And she kept going. They actually almost had her arrested at the Forsyth Street Synagogue, but she and Mrs. Kisseloff narrowly managed to avoid it. Well, the next day, Sunday, there's a meeting, and meeting of a very large group meeting of women, and they established what they call the Ladies Anti-Beef Trust Association to lead the boycott. And among other things, its job was to print and distribute Yiddish language circulars in the tenements to build support. One of them read, "Eat no meat while the trust is taking the meat from the bones of your women and children." I mean, really graphic stuff. The Ladies Anti-Beef Association, Beef Trust Association, also recruited like-minded women outside of Manhattan to organize local committees. And they reached out to the various synagogues and Stieblach and benevolent societies, the Landsmannschaften, and also the lodges in the Jewish quarter. And over the next week, the boycott spread to Brooklyn, to the Bronx, to Harlem, to Newark, and even as far away as Boston. The next day, they were back on the streets, and the demonstrations continued for several more days until all the butcher shops on the Lower East Side had closed. And this is an illustration from the front page of the May 17th edition of the Forward. It shows a Jewish man being crushed by a joint effort of what's called the Meat Trust, which is represented by the steer on the left, and the Kosher Meat Trust, which was represented by a slaughterer here, which was what they were starting to call their own butchers. Now, one of the things that struck me as very interesting was the blame game. Who blamed whom for what? And it turns out that nobody really blamed anybody that they couldn't see immediately ahead of them in the supply chain. I'll tell you what I mean. You have women on the streets who are blaming their own butchers for the rise in prices. But as a practical matter, the butchers weren't really responsible for the rise in prices, or at least not for much of them. They were paying what the slaughterhouses demanded, or else they couldn't get beef. The slaughterhouses weren't taking any responsibility. They were pointing to the cartel in Chicago. And when these folks were interviewed, they said, no, don't blame us. It's the cattlemen in the West. There are fewer cows this year, and that's why prices are high. In fact, it was these men, it was these packers who were mostly responsible for manipulating the prices. And they had local representatives in New York who met every week and decided on how much meat they were going to import from the Midwest. And they did it very, very clearly in order to maximize their own profits. But the local scene, so these are the guys who were responsible, but the local scene in New York is pitting Jew against Jew. It's housewives against butchers, it's butchers against wholesalers, it's secular against the Orthodox, it's the Eastern Europeans against the German Jews, and it also exacerbated other frictions like that between the Jews and the police, which was not a love marriage at this point. The police were very brutal with some of the unionizing, the labor movement strikes. And so they were used to clubbing Jewish men with their nightsticks. What wasn't, what nobody was used to was women getting clubbed in the street. This was new, and it was unseemly as far as the standards of, it's unseemly anytime, it'd be unseemly today, but it was even more so in 1902. It was not something that you did. So before long, every kosher butcher shop on the Lower East Side had either closed its doors or had its doors closed for them. And the newspapers, interestingly enough, were fairly sympathetic to the women up to a point. The Forward, the socialist paper, cheered them on with a headline that read, "Brava, brava Jewish women." The Forward could see no wrong in this. They thought the women were wonderful. They didn't see people getting clubbed, and they didn't see windows breaking. They saw patriotic women standing up against corporate greed. And they were 100% behind this from the beginning to the end. The New York World was also sympathetic on their editorial page. They actually compared the whole affair to the Boston Tea Party. And they weren't the only newspaper to do it. And they asserted that it's impossible not to feel sympathy for these East Side housewives. Well, not so the New York Times. It will not do to have a swarm of ignorant and infuriated women going about any part of the city with petroleum, destroying goods and trying to set fire to the shops of those against whom they're angry. The Times, of course, was owned by German Jews. It was a Sulzberger family, as a matter of fact. I don't know whether they were related to the Sulzberger of Sulzberger and Schwartzel. I suspect they probably were, but I couldn't find a common ancestor, and I did look. But the Times was owned by German Jews, and it didn't need much persuading to condemn the protesters. It called them ignorant. It called them a dangerous class of people who don't understand the duties or the rights of Americans. Well, it was probably inevitable that some control over the strike was going to pass into the hands of men. After all, to build support for their movement, the women had to reach out to other organizations, and almost all of them were male-dominated in this era in the Lower East Side. It also did not sit well with the men to see their women clubbed in the streets. And it was the men who actually had the most experience handling contentious situations that transcended the Jewish community. Men like Dr. David Blaustein, who was superintendent of the Educational Alliance, which was a settlement house that actually was set up with German Jewish money to acculturate the great unwashed Eastern Europeans. And then Joseph Barondess was another one. He was a labor activist. And both of these men became part of the leadership of the movement. And they supervised essentially the establishment of a coalition that was called the Allied Conference for Cheap Kosher Meat. Notice no reference to women in that title, because the Ladies Association was just one of many organizations that belonged to this Allied Conference. Interestingly enough, it does not appear that the women resented this. And I looked very carefully for that because I assumed that it would probably not sit well with them that men were kind of usurping their movement. But remember, this was not a feminist uprising. This was not women who were looking for power for their own sake. This was women who were looking for cheap kosher meat. And to the extent that the men were on their side and they had the same goal, there really was not resentment, or very much of it anyway, that I could find. So how the boycott ended was complicated. It was with sort of more of a whimper than a bang, actually. You can read the book for how it wound down, but suffice it to say that the rabbis got involved. There were negotiations with the wholesalers, and ultimately the wholesalers backed down. After all, their whole purpose in doing this was to raise their profits. And if nobody was buying meat, nobody was making any money off of it. So it was essentially an experiment that failed. And so you'd have to say that the strike was a success, but it was a limited one. Limited because it happened again. Happened again in 1908, it happened in 1917, it happened again during the Depression. The price went up, the women took to the streets. It was always women. All these movements were launched by women, but nothing on the scale of the 1902 boycott. That was always the high watermark here. What I found most compelling was that without prior experience, with minimal resources, these women managed to organize themselves virtually overnight into a powerful fighting force, and they took on well-funded, vested corporate interests, and they beat them. And these were women who emerged from obscurity to do this job. They were, and they sank right back into obscurity when it was over. You never heard from any of them again. One of them, I think, worked on suffrage, but that was about all. But they were trailblazers. This was the vanguard of homemaker organized Jewish activism in America. And the same strategies were used in the rent strikes that took place shortly after 1904 and 1908. There were rent strikes, one later, a couple more after that. And the 1902 meat strike was explicitly called out as a precedent, and they used the same tactics. Tactics like leafleting, street meetings, and other kinds of community organizing. These tenant strikes were also female-led, but it was a completely different cast of characters. Not one of the women from the meat strike emerged during either of the tenant strikes. So after it was over, immigrant Jewish women didn't need any more persuading that they were capable of uniting and effecting change in their new homeland. And we saw that in their actions in suffrage demonstrations later on, labor actions that post-dated the kosher meat strike as well. And although the struggle is not well remembered today, I actually only found references to it maybe up until the 1930s, or early, not even the 30s, late 1920s, before Paul or Hyman pulled it out of history. And so it's not well remembered today, but we owe it a debt of gratitude, because what was pioneered in 1902 is still what's used today when there's a lapse in corporate behavior, when prices go up too high, whatever it is. The tactics remain the same. Now, this isn't a traditional book talk, so I can't exactly sit down and sign copies of books, but if anybody does want to buy the book, it's available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, or from the publisher's website, which is Potomac Books of the University of Nebraska Press. But what authors are doing during the pandemic is signing labels that can be affixed to the inside of the book. So if you buy a book and you would like it to be signed, drop me a note through the website. It's greatkoshermeatwar.com. and I'd be very happy to write one and put it in an envelope and send it to you. So let me stop here, and I would be very happy at this point to answer any questions.
So first of all, that was fabulous. Thank you so much. I mean, your images are amazing. And what I loved especially was how you talked about the research process at the beginning, because our audience really needs to understand that you are one of the most extraordinary researchers that I have ever met. And I've learned so much from being in conversation with you.
Can I have that on tape, ma'am?
What?
Can I have that on tape?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. They're recording it. You've got it. So, and it was, I want to tell everybody that we met because you wanted to talk about Paula Hyman's article, Paula Hyman of blessed memory. And you knew that I was interested in women's history. And what's so important to understand is that when she wrote that article in 1976, women's history was like beginning to burgeon, but it wasn't paying any attention to Jewish women. And she looked for a subject that would get attention in terms of the new women's history that was emerging, because they were really interested in things like consumer activism and labor activism. And when I listened to you talk about how old the women were, and I remember her coming to the conclusion of that they were mostly mothers, and you documented that so much better than she was able to. The difference in to research what you did today compared to researching what she had to do back then is just really, really stunning. It just showed us. It's so remarkable. So at the end, you actually showed us two strikers who I'm assuming are from the 1909 shirtwaist makers strike. And I think it's really important for everyone to understand, and let me remind you to put more questions in the Q&A. We're going to get to those next. But let me take the prerogative of this and just ask one question. Can you talk about connections between the kosher meat boycott and that huge uprising of the 20,000 that happened just 7 years after this kosher meat boycott?
Organic connections are hard to document between those events. We're reaching a little bit here, but for one example, Pauline Newman. Now, Pauline Newman, who later became well known because of her stewardship of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, and she was in that. She was in New York in 1902. She clearly saw what was going on in this strike. She herself did not emerge until actually the 1907 tenants strike, 7 to 8. But I have to believe she had her eyes open and was watching what was going on with the kosher meat strike. And she definitely owed a debt to Sarah Edelson because she did some of the same things Sarah had done several years earlier. Somebody like Clara Lemlich, it's a little bit harder because she didn't come till, I don't think she had arrived yet. But she came into prominence in 1909. She, however, also, I think she owed a debt to Carolyn Shatzberg for some of the things that she did. But I'm kind of on weak ground here, Pam, drawing a straight, direct line and saying this was this influence and this is the influence, this particular thing that happened a little bit later on. It's not that clear. Right.
I've always assumed that some of the daughters of those women were the ones who made the shirtwaist makers strike.
And that's exactly what Paula Hyman said. That was exactly her wording. Right.
Exactly. If not the leaders, then they were living in these houses where they saw their mothers going out and making a strike.
And these women would have been all too old to have
right.
been.
Oh yeah, they were definitely, but they had young children,
right.
And so their daughters, they were just part of that world. They knew that, and also we have to remember that there had been strikes on the east side of New York going all the way back to the 1880s. So much so that the Industrial Commission is looking around 1900 and says there's always a strike somewhere on the east side of New York going on.
Right.
So the women also have the example of that from what they had seen with their men. So we actually have a lot of really good questions. I'm going to start with the first one. Did the price gouging impact other Jewish communities in Washington or Baltimore or Philadelphia?
Yeah, it impacted everyone, but there weren't the same kinds of uprisings in those towns at that time. There definitely were meat strikes in Baltimore, but I don't think they were quite in 1902. I think they happened a little bit later. And remember, the prices they were seesawing. Every time that the producers felt they could get away with something, they'd raise prices again. So there were issues in Philadelphia, there were issues in Baltimore, but I don't think they were in 1902.
Right. Yeah, but they really do. This like launches really decades of activism, especially given what the theme of this series is, but decades of activism, because you don't go as far as the 1930s, but you have the same kind of thing going on in the 1930s in terms of price gouging over food prices, and also how people respond to the landlords throwing people out of their apartments because they're not paying the rent. So that definitely has an impact. One of our attendees wants to know, was the strike mostly made up of Eastern European Jews, or if there were German Jews involved, why was the New York Times so against it?
I know it as a strike of Russian and Eastern European Jews. I think the German Jews first of all, there were many fewer German Jews in the United States, and they were earlier arrivals. And most of them, although a lot of them got their start on the Lower East Side, most of them had left it by then. And a lot of them were actually quite successful. Earlier I got a question from somebody about what do the German Jewish women feel about it, and I honestly don't know. This was, to my understanding, basically Russian and Eastern European Jewish women who were mostly recent immigrants, some of whom didn't really speak much English, and were quite new to the United States.
Right. At this point, we really have we prefer to call them Central European Jews. They were German-speaking Jews, but they came earlier, decades earlier, and as you said, some of them, their husbands owned those slaughterhouses that you pointed us to. That was amazing to see. That's where the UN stands today. Kathy Seltz said that you indicated that when the butcher shops ended their strike, the prices went up instead of down. Why? Why did that happen?
That's a really good question. The women assumed that the butchers were trying to make up for the fact that they had made no money during the time that they were shut down, and that they were gouging the women as a way of kind of making up for that. That was the belief. I don't know if that's true or not. There were other accusations that were hurled at the butchers that I think were unfair. One of them was this constant image that the butchers are gouging us so their wives can be dripping with diamonds. And we saw that a lot. And there certainly were wealthier butchers, but by and large, and we can really pretty much prove it, the butchers weren't doing any better than really anybody else was on the Lower East Side. And the proof of that is that when this strike went on for just a couple of weeks, a lot of them had to shut down. They didn't even have the resources to get them through a few weeks of closure and continue to do business. So I don't think that, I think they got a raw deal, to tell you the truth, to a certain extent.
Yeah.
But I don't really know why the prices did go up. I don't think their wholesale prices went up any higher, but they did certainly take the opportunity to raise the prices.
Right.
And that was the end of the relationship between the women and the butchers.
Right. Yeah. Leslie Shapiro has commented, I believe it's still the middlemen who are largely responsible for setting the prices.
I suspect she's absolutely right.
I think she's absolutely right. But so there's an interesting question from one of the attendees. Why were the strikes usually launched by women?
Oh, that's a good question. Now, I hesitate to get into stereotypes, but the modal family on the Lower East Side at the turn of the 20th century had a man who worked outside of the home and a woman who didn't. Now, it doesn't say that some of the women didn't find work. Sometimes it was taking work at home, taking piece goods in. Sometimes it was bringing in a boarder. I mean, there were variants. Sarah Edelson, who worked at the saloon, and also she was a matchmaker. So it doesn't mean that the women didn't earn income, but the women were basically in charge of the house. And the men typically would turn over their pay envelopes to their women at the end of the week. So the idea of how the economy worked, how the household ran, really, the women had a great deal more influence than the men did. And they were therefore the bellwethers. They were the first ones to realize the money was not going to go far enough. Plus also they were home during the day when all of this was going on, and the men were mostly out working if they had jobs. So I think that's why these were the people who were going to feel it first, because they were the ones who had to haggle with the butchers. And Pam, you may want to add to that, but I think that's what I would say to that.
Yeah, I mean, they're the ones who are responsible for taking that paycheck and then figuring out how they're going to pay the rent out of it and how they're going to buy the food out of it. And they needed every single penny. I mean, my favorite quote, I loved yours about let the women make the strike, but my favorite quote comes from one of the women who gets arrested, and she turns to the judge and she says, "We're not rioting, only see how thin our children are." That this was really about, they needed every single penny to make ends meet. This was a really poor community. I love this question from one of our attendees, wants to know about what tech did they use to spread the word. So they don't have copy machines, they don't have Mimeo machines. So were they writing out handbills and posters by hand? How did they get them printed?
Well, that's a good question. The short answer is I don't know. But there were printing presses. There were definitely printing presses on the Lower East Side. They probably went to one of the newspapers and had them, run some handbills. But I do know that it was printed. They weren't writing these out by hand. There was also a lot of door knocking. This was and street corner, and people talking on street corners. I mean, the Lower East Side, you could hear a socialist lecture or an anarchist lecture on any street corner, in any week. So that was it. And then there were community bulletin boards as well, where you could actually put things up on the wall and people would read them.
Yeah, I mean, there were definitely printers and they would print up these they were called handbills, and they would print them up, because I've seen the handbill that Lillian Wald had printed up in 1918 when she was made in charge of the Nurses Emergency Council, and she wanted to get people to volunteer to help with the Spanish flu, to help the hospitals and the city that was being so overwhelmed. So I think we have time for only one more question, which is really, I'm so sorry that we need to end. But I think this one comes from one of our attendees. Is there another instance you know of when the Torah reading was interrupted as a matter of social justice? Or might that be your next book?
I don't know of another instance of it. This is the only one I do know of. But I'm working right now, as Pam well knows, on the tenant strikes. And I will, it's a possibility that it happened then too. I'll know after I've really finished the research. I don't know of it. And in fact, I had certainly never heard of Bitul HaTamid. I don't know too many Jewish people who had heard of it, unless they're really steeped in Jewish literature and Jewish law. But it's a very interesting concept that matters of social justice are of such overwhelming importance that even the Torah can be put aside in order to discuss them. I thought that was very moving, actually. It's one of the reasons I wanted to put it in the book.
Yeah, I mean, I'm familiar with the concept. I think it's definitely happened in Europe, but I don't know of specific instances where it happened. And this is the only time that I know of it happening in the United States. But I'm sure it happened in other settings as well. So it's just been great being with you. I don't know if Rebecca Sobel or Jack Cunningham want to come back on, or I should wrap up. But thank you to everyone. Kathy Seltz has asked if we will receive a recording of this. This program is being recorded, and you should be able to see it on the YouTube page of the Capital Jewish Museum within 24 to 48 hours. I strongly urge you to buy this book, to read this book. It's fabulous. I will tell you, however, that I was a vegetarian before I read it. I'm still a vegetarian. Thank you to Scott Seligman, and enjoy reading the book. Goodbye, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you.